I was a neonatal ICU nurse at Midland Children's Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. Last month, after 12 years of nights, codes, and quiet miracles, I resigned because of one case I still can't explain. 12 years in a Level IV NICU teaches you a particular kind of patience. The unit sprawled across the 6th floor, a warren of glass bays and pod rooms kept at a constant warm hush. The air sweet with humidified oxygen and chlorhexidine. 58 beds. Transport teams flighting in babies from 3 states. About 1,200 admissions a year prematurity. Congenital anomalies. Everything fragile and unfinished about human life. We called it a fortress for the smallest hearts. I loved it. I know the rhythm of alarms the way a violinist knows a score. I can count ventilator breaths in my sleep. But even in the fortress, something walked in one December night that didn't belong to protocols or monitors or the small math of milliliters and milligrams. And it still haunts me. It was December 14, 2023. Night shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. The kind of dark Midwestern winter where the windows turn to mirrors and all you see of the city faraway plane lights stitched across the sky. I was charge nurse for Pod C and D5 ventilated preemies between 25 and 31 weeks to on high-frequency oscillatory ventilators, one on bubble CPAP and a couple of grower feeders who were just discovering how to coordinate the ancient trick of suck, swallow, breathe. At the 17 a.m., when the unit is usually at its softest, hands warm, voices low, pumps clicking like metronomes, the transport line buzzed. The voice of the flight nurse arrived in our ceiling like a second conscience. Level 3 sending a 29-weeker. Estimated weight 1.2 kilograms. Spontaneous delivery. A PGARS-3 at 1 minute. 5 at 5 minutes. Intubated en route. Persistent DSOTs. Probable neonatal sepsis. Hypotension requiring dopamine at 5 mcg/kg. MIN. ETA 7 minutes. We moved like we always do. Radiant warmer on. Suction checked. Neopuff ready. To 0.0 and to 0.5 ETTs. UVC and UAC trays. Ampicillin. Gentamicin. Vitamin K erythromycin. Thermoregulation gel packs. The respiratory therapist, Tony, stood on my left. Our fellow, Dr. Money, washed her hands up to the elbows and nodded at me through the glass. The door seals side. When the transport isolette rolled in, the smell of night road diesel, cold flooded our carefully filtered air. He was small and complicated and perfect in the way NICU babies are perfect. Skin the color of a rain bruise. Translucent fat pads, a little white hat pulled low. The ETT was taped neatly with duoderm. Blue umbilical catheters curled like punctuation from his belly. The flight nurse's voice was brisk. Maternal fever. Choriomyonitis suspected. Membranes ruptured for 23 hours. Baby initially gasped, then lost tone. Intubated at 6 minutes of life. Transport gas showed pH 7.1 pico at 58 po 46 on 60% FiO. Lactate 5.6. Blood pressure labial despite fluids. We slid him to our warmer. His temperature was 35.6 degrees centigrade. Heart rate 158. Blood pressure 40 to 28 by Doppler. SPO 86% and jittery. Chest rose shallow and fast. I watched his tiny sternum seesaw under the ventilator's push. We set volume guarantee ventilation at 5 milliliters per kilogram. PEP 5. FiO 0.60. Rate 40. The gas from our lab 20 minutes later read pH 7.5. Pico A 52. Po 54. Base deficit 6. We hung ampicillin and gentamicin. Drew blood cultures. Sent ACBC. CRP. Procalcitonin. Started TPN at 80 milliliters per kilogram a day because we didn't know when he'd be ready for trophic feeds. Dopamine went up to 7 mcg/kilogram per minute. We named him in our system with the usual placeholder, Boyev, until the mother could sign. The whiteboard in Pod C got a new line, Boy J, 29 plus 1, 1.6 kilograms. He took the space the way babies do, making the big room curve around him. The hum of the warmer, the whisper of the ventilator. The way the heart rate monitor's green numbers seemed to pulse with the light from the bronchoscope cart. I was adjusting the ETT tape when the first strange thing happened. His saturation climbed when I stopped the ventilator. Not for long, not high. I paused the ventilator to listen for a subtle leak and to feel the chest recoil during passive exhalation. Counting, the way you learn to in this job, 1 Mississippi to Mississippi. In those 2 seconds, his SPO trended from 91 to 95. I restarted the vent. The curve dipped back to 91. I thought it was artifact, finger probe bad or motion. I replaced the probe. Same. Tony frowned, leaned over, tweaked the file a hair. Listened with his stethoscope to both axillae. Equal breath sounds. No obvious pneumothorax on the first x-ray. Maybe an algorithm quirk, he said. Sometimes the averaging window lags. Maybe, but we don't like maybe. We live in numbers and we know their habits. Why would a baby oxygenate better without positive pressure? I made a mental note and went back to the 1,000 small tasks that keep a baby alive. At 3:03 a.m., his mother arrived. She was young and exhausted and shaking in the way of postpartum fevers. We got her a chair, warmed blankets. I explained the tubes in my steady voice, how we were supporting his breathing, how antibiotics were working even if they were invisible. He needs a name, I said. Names help us talk to him. She looked at him as if the word itself would bruise him. Evan, she whispered. My grandfather's name. We wrote Evan in blue dry erase marker on the whiteboard above his warmer. I wrote mine underneath, like we always do. Primary RN, Claire. It was when she said his name that he opened his eyes. Preemies peel their eyelids back like old tape when they're ready to look. 29-weekers' eyes are dark coins and they move in little jerks, a nervous system calibrating itself. Evan's eyes opened and found where my voice was. If you haven't stood at a warmer at 3 a.m. and had a baby who is mostly air and wires, look for your face. It's hard to explain what it does to your own heart. He looked and then, I swear, he stilled, as if he needed to balance something fragile inside his chest. We dimmed the lights. I lowered my voice further. Let my sentences be a steady metronome. His heart rate came down from 168 to 152. The saturations floated at 93. His tiny hand uncurled like a question mark, becoming a period. At 3:17 a.m., red flag 1 raised its quiet head. His labs returned, white blood cells 3.8 low for infection. CRP 0.6 near normal. Procalcitone and 0.08, platelets 220. If you've chased neonatal sepsis as long as I have, you know how wrong that can be. Babies can be septic with normal labs early? Yes. But the clinical picture: prolonged rupture, maternal fever, hypotension, lactate should have had his inflammatory markers shouting. We sent a repeat. It came back similar. Dr. Money pursed her lips. Keep the antibiotics. We'll trend. He's clinically sick. We nodded. But the first rule lab corroborates story had bent a little. At 3:39 a.m., I watched his chest rather than his monitor. The ventilator side. The chest obeyed. But the way his chin softened, the way his eyelids fluttered, did not match the sedative we'd started. A low fentanyl drip at 1 mcg, kgr for comfort. Babies on fentanyl breathe shallow, often more regular. Evan's pattern was purposeful now. Tricky, he would take a breath before the machine did. Exactly once every 6 or 7 cycles. Tony noticed. Triggered breaths, he said. But the sensitivity is right. We tweaked the settings. His triggered breaths kept threading the ventilator's rhythm like a stubborn melody bleeding through static. Red flag 2 was quieter than the first, but stranger. The machine's rhythm was not in charge, and the baby seemed to know it. At 4:02 a.m., we placed amplitude-integrated EEG leads EEG to screen for seizures. Preemies seize like waves under the surface. The body stays quiet, but the cortex crackles. The EEG showed sleep-wake cycling at 30-minute intervals. which would have been comforting if he'd been a grower feeder. Sedated, ventilated, hypotensive babies don't usually show such clean cycling. The tracing's baseline lifted and settled like someone breathing in a different room. Artifact? Asked our neurotech on call. We checked the leads again. Secure. The paper kept telling the same secret. Red flag 3 was not a shout, but a hum. His brain, at 4 a.m., on fentanyl, cycled as if it were being rocked by something we could not see. The unit had its own weather by then, the glass fogged at the corners even though the room was dry. The scent of chlorhexidine was sharper than usual, a clean that felt like cold metal on your tongue. The hall lights outside our pod had gone into night mode, a strip of dim amber across the floor. In the quiet between ventilator sighs and infusion pumps, you could hear the soft click when someone at the desk turned a page. At 4:13 a.m., Evan whispered my name. There isn't a machine in a NICU that should make that sound. There isn't a baby at 29 weeks with a tube in his trachea who can shape consonants. But what I heard came from the opening of his isolette, from the place where the warmed air slips out like a breath. It was not a nurse in the hall, not a mother, not a radio. It was 3 letters, fragile as tissue and sharp as a pin, Claire. I looked up so fast the world tilted. The whiteboard with his name and mine above it shone back at me like a mirror. I felt my scalp tighten. Tony, who had been charting behind me, looked over his shoulder. "Did you, Ash?" I said, which is ridiculous, because the sound was impossible to interrupt. The monitors were steady. Heart rate 154, sat 94, blood pressure 46/31. The aEEG baseline lifted a hair, as if the cortex had leaned toward the sound too. And then, before I could say anything rational, before I could find a word that made sense of a baby speaking past a tube, it happened again, a little stronger this time, threaded with warm air, and the faintest rasp of condensation. Claire, I will tell you about fear and how it changes shape in a room like that. It is not the panic you feel when a baby brattles and the world condenses to chest compressions and epinephrine syringes. It is a cold that starts at the base of your skull and walks, neatly, down your spine, counting each vertebra as it goes. It has time to look around. It notices the whiteboard and your own handwriting on it. It notices that the ventilator is still delivering 40 breaths per minute and that the baby's mouth is taped closed around a plastic tube. It notices your hands don't want to move. I moved anyway. I did what we always do. I assessed. I checked the tube depth at the lip. 7.0 centimeters. Still good. Bilateral breath sounds. I checked the ventilator circuit for leaks that, somehow, could have made vowels. I reseated the water trap. I checked for a coworker with a bad sense of humor. The room was a diagram of normal. Would you have stayed in that room with me? I thought, and surprised myself by hearing the shape of the question rather than the words. Would you have leaned closer? I did. Evan, I said, very quietly, my face at the porthole, my breath fogging the clear plastic. I'm here. The isolette air was warmer than my skin. The plastic held a faint smell of detergent. Inside, his hands lay open, perfectly still. The pulse ox probe glowed weak on his right foot. The tape the color of his own skin held the tube against his upper lip. His eyes were half open in that preemie way where sleep and wakefulness blur into the same dark shine. The aEEG baseline rose a little more. Claire, the isolette breathed. I stepped back and knocked the cuff of my glove against the warmer rail hard enough to sting. Tony stood now, his eyes wide, his mouth align. I heard that, he said, not like a question. I nodded. We were the only two at the bedside. The mother in the chair had drifted into a fever sleep. Her hand lay open under a warmed blanket, palm lines glowing like a map. The hallway was empty. At the desk, someone laughed at something on a screen and then stopped, as if they remembered where they were. Inside the isolette, a bubble of condensation crawled down the circuit tubing and burst with a tiny sound. The aftershock was not a crash but a new alignment. Every ordinary thing acquired an angle. The alarm tones were a shade off. The ventilator's sigh sounded like something thinking. My own name. which I had worn like a badge for years, embroidered on scrubs, written on whiteboards, printed on labels, became a weight in the room. We did what rational people do when the air turned strange. We measured more. We drew another gas at for 28 a.m., pH 7.31, peak OA 47, PO 62 on 0.555. Better. We check lactate 3.1 and falling. Blood pressure up to 50/34 on the same dopamine. Urine output picked up. If you wrote it down, it would read like improvement. If you stood there, breathing the same air a baby had spent a word in, it felt like being watched. At 4:33 a.m., the hallway camera outside Pod C displayed a frozen frame, and then, for 2 seconds, nothing. When it came back, my own body was a step to the left that I do not remember taking. The charge board flickered and reset. IT said later it was a glitch in the server during a scheduled backup that misaligned a timestamp. We get glitches. Our equipment lives on the edge of capacities. But for that 20-minute stretch, we had a jitter in the electrical animal that keeps a hospital awake at night. Dr. Mani came back into the pod. I told her, careful with my words, that we'd had an odd ventilator noise that sounded like a voice. She looked at me over her mask. The look wasn't unkind, but it had the shape of what doctors use to set the walls back up. Sleep debt can play tricks, she said. The brain is a mimic. I nodded and did not say my name again. At 5:07 a.m., Evan aEEG showed a burst of fast activity like the ripple a thrown stone makes before a surface calms. If it had been a term baby, I would have wondered about REM sleep. In a ventilated 29-weeker on fentanyl, it was wrong and beautiful. I wrote it down. We keep writing when we don't understand. We tried to replicate what we thought we had heard. We controlled the variables, the way NICU people do when we are afraid of superstition. Tony loosened a circuit connection and retightened it to see if the whine of escaping pressure could have shaped vowels. We tapped the water trap. We spoke my name at the same angle to the isolette porthole, with the same breath, with our masks off, then on. We swapped pulse ox probes. We changed the pressure limits. The ventilator obligingly behaved like a machine. The isolette was a box with warm air. The quiet was only quiet. The mother woke and asked for his tiny hand. We threaded our fingers around his fingers, two gloved, one bare, because she asked and because touch is medicine in a place like this, even if it doesn't show up on a lab report. She leaned close and said his name, not mine, not even hers, his. He did not speak. He only lay there and grew his invisible bones and arranged his blood around new oxygen. At 5:49 a.m., his blood cultures flagged negative in an early read. At 6, I handed report to the day charge, who listened and did not write the whisper down, because you can put that in the box in the electronic record that says sound. I did not add it to the narrative either. I watched the sun drag pale light across the parking garage and felt like my body was 2 steps behind my eyes. That was night 1. Night 2. He was better. We weaned the FiO to 0.40. Dopamine went down to 5. His temperature held steady without the extra gel packs. It continued to show clean cycling, and we all pretended not to find it odd. I told myself what I tell new nurses. Babies surprise you. They don't read our books. We used his name often, Evan, as we used every baby's name, to anchor him to a world of voices. I avoided my own, around 3 a.m., while I was priming a new TPN bag. The mother's fever spiked again. We called OB. They came, soothed, ordered cultures of their own. The room was full of gentle, practice language. The ESO box glowed. At 3:28 a.m., without any of us bending near the porthole, the isolette breathed my name a 3rd time. I heard it before I knew I'd heard it. My hands were busy. My mind, downgraded into the rituals that keep lines clean and air free of bubbles. The sound threaded those tasks like a steel wire. Claire, it said, softer than the first night, but clearer, as if the mouth of the air knew the shape better now. The E climbed the way it had climbed the night before. The ventilator did not change. The mother slept. Tony was in another bay. I did not call him. I set the TPN on the pole and put my hand on the isolette frame to feel whether any vibration could make a syllable. The plastic was a steady hum of airflow, nothing else. My eyes burned. The clock read 3:29. If you're still here, you're braver than I was. I thought it like a confession I needed to make to someone later. I stood back and saw the whiteboard. Evan, Claire, blue marks on white, as innocent as a kindergarten roll. I took the marker and put a line through my name. Not a cross out, just a line, like a breath. You will think this is silly. Nurses are not superstitious. We are exquisitely practical. We know where we set our pens down and how to find a 24-gauge catheter in the dark. But we also work where things leave and arrive through doors we can see, and we learn to nod at the air. On night 3, we extubated him to bubble CPAP. The ventilator stopped its sighing. The room changed key. Bubble CPAP makes a wet chuckle that sounds like a creak under ice. He tolerated it with a brief descent to 81 that we fix with a little more flow. He opened his eyes again and tracked light like a cat. We started trophic feeds, 2 milliliters every 3 hours of his mother's milk through an orogastric tube, a thread of liquid that smelled faintly like warm bread. He looked like a person who intended to stay. I made the note: good tone, good color, good fight. If the story had ended there, I might still be working nights. I might have filed the whisper under things that happen when your whole job is listening for something that isn't a scream. But on night 5, when we had gotten cocky with his progress and weaned his FIO to room air, something happened that made my rational mind step out of the room for a minute and then not come back. It was quiet time to A.M. to 4 A.M. when we dim the lights and keep voices to the kind of whisper that lives directly under the ear. I had pod C to myself because we were short a nurse and I'd taken the stretch. Tony was covering 3 respiratory vents in PADA, popping in and out with his easy walk. Evan's mother had gone home to sleep in her own bed for the first time since that first fever. I was humming quiet, an old habit, nothing with a melody. The computer at the desk had a sleep screen of drifting dandelion seeds. We were the only 3 lights on the floor: the warmer, my computer, the dim line of the hall. At the 47 A.M., the pressure alarms in Evan's bubble CPAP blipped and reset. The water line bubbled harder and then calmed. The aEEG baseline lifted. I leaned in to check that his mask seal was good and that his nares weren't pressed flat. The room smelled like plastic and milk. He opened his eyes. They focused directly on me. Little black pennies. He held them there. His chest rose, fell. The bubbles chuckled, and then, in a voice that sounded like breath traveling over something it had not used in a long time, like a flute found in a drawer, he said, "Claire, clearer. No isolette distortion now. Not air in a circuit." The sound came from him. From a mouth that had never cried more than a shallow rasp since he arrived. His lips did not part the way adult lips do when consonants need them. Preemies' mouths are still learning how to be windows for vowels. But the sound existed in front of his face. It was in the space my name would occupy if you wrote it in steam on a mirror. And then he blinked, the kind of blink that old men do when they are about to say something that matters, and I felt the hair on my forearms rise under my sleeves. I put my hand through the porthole and pressed one finger very gently into his palm. His fingers tightened, not as a grasp reflex, but like an answer. Do you know how hard it is to keep your voice level in a room like that? To keep the grammar of the hospital orders, hourly checks, abbreviations intact when something without a code has occurred. I took my hand back and wrote what I could write. CPAP pressure fluctuation noted. aEEG baseline transient increase. Infant alert. I did not write spoke my name. I looked at the ceiling camera and saw its small red recording light steady, and I thought about how nothing that mattered in that moment was a picture. The day that followed was ordinary in the way that makes nurses superstitious. Everything held. He tolerated feeds like a champ. We advanced volumes. He peed on time. His blood pressures sat up. Culture stayed negative. We high-fived in the hallway with our eyes, because you don't actually touch in the unit for luck. The neonatologist on rounds said, "He's writing his own story," which is the closest you will hear a doctor come to saying I don't know why he is so okay. I don't know how much of what happened next matters to you and how much matters only to me. I know that when people ask for stories, they want the set pieces, the thing that breaks a rule as cleanly as a plate. They want the moment you can point to and say that is where the world bent. So here it is, the sharpest piece, set in glass. On the week he turned 30 weeks, this is a thing we celebrate with tiny paper crowns and a slightly louder cheer when the intensivist isn't looking. The hospital had a network update. It sends emails about these. You learn to ignore them as long as the heart monitors don't blink. Between 2 o'clock and 12 a.m., Pod C's hallway camera recorded nothing. The red light stayed steady. The screen at the desk did not flicker. But when we pulled the log later, because we pulled everything later, the time between 2 hours 0 minutes and 3 seconds and 2 hours 12 minutes and 51 seconds was empty. A white bar, the computer's way of saying no story here. In that white bar, at 2:06 a.m., Evan spoke again. This time, there was no doubt about the direction of the sound. I was changing the OG tube. My hands knew the dance: measure, mark, lubricate, insert, check, aspirate. The room was, as it always is, warm, steady, the sound of bubbles like a creek under snow. "Claire," he said, and my hands froze in midair, because knowing that something impossible can happen does not make you better at standing there when it does. I looked up, he looked at me, and then he said, clear as a bell at the end of a long hallway, "Don't." The second word came apart like tissue underwater. It might have been go. It might have been leave. It might have been nothing at all but the air, tired from asking to be shaped. I stood there and felt a kind of grief I have not had a name for until now. It was not grief for a baby who might die. It was grief for a wall had needed in my head, the one between what I can count and what I cannot. It had hairline cracks now. It would not fall yet. It would turn my head at night when I tried to sleep and make me listen to things that were not there. You will ask who else heard. Tony heard the first two that first night. He will tell you what he tells me. It was a leak, or the way the air hit the porthole at that angle. We were tired. Dr. Monty did not hear any of it. She heard my report, carefully cleaned of anything that would embarrass me if printed. The mother did not hear it. She never did. I suppose that is a kindness, or be the point. At discharge she cried into my shoulder and told me had saved his life with the whole team. And I nodded and did not say. He called me by a name I have never hated as much as I did that night. We tried over the next week to prove we were wrong. We asked Neuro to review the aEEG ribbons. They said the cycling was unusual but reassuring. We so wanted that answer that we put it in bold. We asked RT to test the CPAP circuit with a decibel meter, a ridiculous thing no one has a protocol for. They humored me. The sound it made was a sound we could not put letters to. We asked IT to pull whatever scrap of video might exist from the hallway, from the pod, from the warmers. They sent us a polite email about how the update had fallen within the maintenance window and that no patient care areas had been affected. The white bar in the log was as clean as a snowfield. When we failed to replicate the whisper, we did what medicine always does with what it cannot reproduce. We told ourselves it was an artifact. At 31 weeks and for days, Evan came off CPAP for the first time and slept, a real sleep, the kind that looks like a tiny person dreaming. He smiled. We tell new parents that preemie smiles are gas, because sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't, and you should not hang a whole future on an early reflex. It was a smile anyway. He weighed 1.58 kilos. He took 10 milliliters at breast with a nipple shield like he had read the instructions. He had no retinopathy of prematurity, only immature vessels tracing their delicate red maps. His hearing screen pinged present in both ears, the string of beeps like a spaceship landing in our quiet. I put in for a transfer today shift the way burned out nurses do. Told myself it was for my joints and my marriage and my circadian rhythm. I told no one about the dream where a warm plastic voice whispered my name from the bottom of a stairwell. Day shift came. My body did not stop turning towards sounds that were not mine. I snapped at a new grad for charting infant agitated because the baby had flexed his foot like a dancer. I cried in the med room because a paper towel tore in a way that sounded like a word. It was not the NICU's fault. It was the room I had built in my head to practice here. It did not have space for voices that lived in air rather than throats. I resigned at the end of January. The email I sent said thank you in capacity and the usual language of leaving. I brought in donuts on my last day and wrote a card for everyone and went into Pod C one more time to say goodbye to the babies who would never know my name for long enough for it to matter. Evan was in a step-down bay by then, wearing a onesie with tiny bears, a nasal cannula like a little fishing line. His mother was holding him skin to skin, and he was looking at the single dark thing a 32-weeker will choose in a room full of light, the place where her collarbone meets her neck. I put my hand on the foot of the crib, a habit I had when I wanted to feel grounded. Good job, I whispered to him, because we say it to them and they seem to know. The air did not move any differently than it ever did. The room smelled like milk and warm plastic and the ghost of chlorhexidine. He did not say my name again. He only breathed, the way I had always wanted his own. On my way out, I passed the whiteboard in Pod C. Someone had wiped my name away weeks ago, replaced it with another nurse's in black marker. Under Evan, somebody had drawn a small blue star. As I rounded the corner toward the elevators, the hallway camera's red light blinked once and steadied. I thought ridiculous, human thing that it was a nod. When the elevator doors closed, the stainless steel held my face like water. If you've listened this far, maybe you understand why I left a job I loved. It wasn't because of one voice or one baby. It was because the case put a crack in a certainty I had needed to do the work. We draw lines in hospitals because we must, alive, dead, apneic, stable, artifact. We walk those lines like tightropes and learn to wave when we pass each other above the floor. But there are places where the line does not hold for long enough to let you hear your own name spoken by a mouth that should not be able to form it. And once you have stood there, your feet remember a different balance. Maybe consciousness begins earlier than our tools can see. Maybe names are bridges and not labels. Maybe a brain the size of your thumb knows more about you than your own eyes do. I tell myself this is not about ghosts, that it is about the shape of breath and the euphonics of bubbles and the way air moves when it wants to be useful. I tell myself that fetuses learn voices in utero and that preemies drag the womb with them for a while like a coat. I tell myself that my name is a vowel train easy for air to ride. I tell myself all of this and carry a quiet that is not peaceful. The button I promised you is small. A month after I left, I went back to drop off a stack of blankets a church group had donated in my name because that is the kind of thing people do when you move on. I walked past Pod C without meaning to. The whiteboard had a new list of babies. None of them were mine. The blue star was gone. I would have kept walking except that, from inside the pod, I heard an RT laugh at something a nurse said, and then the hallway air exhaled a sound exactly the shape and size of my name. No voice, no vowel, just the contour. I stood very still until it was only air again, and then I went home and did not come back. If this shook me, the next case made this one feel harmless.